Please welcome panel moderator, John Carlin.
Good afternoon. The theme of this panel is how to protect yourself and your company. And I'm very pleased to not only have some of the most distinguished names in the field who have lived through and survived, and their careers have survived, along with them personally surviving very serious incidents, but also a group that I've personally had the opportunity to work with. Some of the most serious incidents, whether it's national security actors or sophisticated criminal groups. And with that, I'm going to jump right in with the first question to Brad. Brad, you've bounced around a little bit. Apparently can't hold a job, and been the Chief Information Security Officer for GM, for Target. You're currently at Raytheon, along with many other experiences. And maybe we could just start with you. From what you've seen living through actual incidents, what are some themes about how to protect yourself the audience can take away?
Sure. Thanks, John. And by the way, you're pretty close right behind me as far as bouncing around, by the way. So I think when you think about protecting yourself and the company, I think they're one and the same. I think when you look at some of the root causes of where companies and individuals don't handle it right, comes down to really two things for me. One is either they don't have a plan, and two, if they have a plan, they haven't practiced it, right? So I like to talk about it in the concept of like relentless preparation, is that the world we live in today, right, we all know it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when your company will be in a cyber crisis. So you don't want to wait until that day you're in a crisis to figure out that you don't have a plan and you've never practiced it before. I like to use the soccer team analogy. You ever see like a 5-year-old soccer team, right, playing soccer? It's like a clump of kids going, like, chasing the ball around the field. That's what a company looks like when they don't have a plan and they haven't practiced it. What you want to look like is a World Cup soccer team, right, where everyone has a position, plays their position, they're really good at their position, and after the game, they get together and they say, okay, what worked well and what didn't, and how do you apply that to the cyber world?
Following up on that, turning to you, Siobhan, as a hired gun who gets brought in to protect companies when they're going through the worst. Siobhan's a former Wall Street Journal reporter, and you help with the communications. And Brad talked about relentless preparation, but I think a lot of times when folks think about preparation, what they're thinking about is the technical preparation on responding to an incident. But where I've seen some of the biggest clumping is actually from the most senior executives, including at some of the largest publicly held company, because they're all very interested in what that comms statement is going to be. So maybe you could give a little bit of your experience on, is that something that you can practice in advance, and what type of lessons should companies take?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point, and I think that now that cybersecurity is seen, I think, as a broader business risk, more companies are understanding that it goes well beyond the technical. Usually, as actually everybody on this panel knows, when you have an incident, you've got the technical response, of course, but you've also got the legal response and the communications response. And I think Brad's point about practicing is really, really critical, especially when it comes to communications. And that's internal and external, because it's really just broadly stakeholder management. And the one add that I would have, just broadly speaking to what Brad was saying, is you need everyone to play their role, and the most important role is having a crisis captain, having someone who can ultimately call the shots. And that shouldn't usually be the CEO, it should be somebody else. But when you're talking about how it is that whole team plays together, communications actually pervades almost all of it. There are a lot of legal questions there in terms of what you can and can't say, and particularly the sequencing of it. Do you have to disclose something publicly, file an 8K or not? And there are a lot of decisions there that come into play. And those are the kinds of things that the CEO typically will really care about, which is why, again, having things like a playbook and practicing it is really important, because sometimes the CEO doesn't realize how much they care about communications and how they're showing up in a crisis until they're actually in it. And so then you can get sort of panicked responses. You get people, frankly, oversharing usually. And that can be really hard, because if you're oversharing, you can't walk it back. And usually if you're oversharing at a time that you don't have very much information, you're speculating. And that's not where you want to find yourself in a cyber incident.
Hey, Jennifer, you've been CISO from the defense sector and at Lockheed to another highly regulated space in telecommunications at Verizon, and now in CVS, where you have the best of both worlds, because you have both retail and you have the pharmaceutical side that's regulated. What's your view on both the theme of how you can prepare yourself, but also following up on the role that communications play?
Right, thanks. And I really think about, and to build off of what Brad and Siobhan shared, when I think about the robustness of the playbooks and the preparedness activities that should be performed, they need to meet a couple criteria for me. And one is velocity. We've talked about this a lot at the panel. They have to be able to react with the velocity with which events are occurring and unfolding. They need to be agile in regards that, based on the events unfolding, you've got to be able to pivot and pivot quickly. They need to be scalable. And having run several incidents, sometimes people think it's just 5 people in a room. And having run some significant incidents, you can actually end up having a workforce of several thousand people doing something across all of these elements. Whether, like the communications one is so important, right? Even as the comm strategy is developed, you've got to build that out internally throughout your company, externally, whether it's media or even through your account management practices, and even to your consumers, depending on what your business looks like. So I really think about agility, velocity, agility, flexibility, and the last one is scalability. Because you've got to be able to make sure that the playbooks you have enable you to scale up. And that's one of the themes, I think, where companies don't do as well on. They don't launch fast enough with enough resources to be able to deal with what's going to happen the next 12, 24 hours, 2 days from now, a week from now. And so in our role as CISOs, we should, and trying to lead through that response, running the playbooks, we've got to be looking out ahead and looking at all sorts of permutations. So those are the few things I think about, and the communications is just so critical to the success of how you get to the other side of it, right?
Yeah, no, it's a key point. And I found, so in my career outside of cyber, I've dealt with crises in the national security community when I was running the national security division for the Justice Department, ranging from terrorism to hurricane response. And when we think about, building on your point, Jen, what makes cyber different? And for those of you living it, it's almost in your DNA. So it can be hard to explain this to other members of the business who are not living it, which are 2 things that make a cyber crisis different. One is the speed, as Jennifer said, or the velocity of the incident. But the second is the uncertainty. So as bad as certain other crises are, an active shooter situation, a natural disaster, there actually is usually some forewarning in the case of the natural disaster for preparedness, or in the event of tragic situations like shooting situations, you know what happened fairly quickly after the incident. But here, the business leaders need to make key communication decisions, who to talk to, what to say, and also decisions in terms of the business, right? Do I shut a system down and take the cost? Do I keep it going in that uncertainty? And so turning to this group, how do you handle that?
I guess I'd love to jump in on that, because I think that the uncertainty comes in so many different ways, but particularly if you're thinking about a communications chain, usually the first thing is, well, what's the threshold for communicating in the first place, right? And usually it is, well, we have to tell our customers or whoever, or employees, whoever the stakeholders are who are most affected by the situation. Well, when do you do that? Like, what's the threshold? And so in these incidents, and this is why, again, trying to think through simulations and playbooks in advance is helpful. What's that threshold how much information do you need before you go out? Because you can say, well, we had a thing, or we might have a thing, but you can't say anything else. Well, that's not gonna inspire a lot of confidence. So, but you're never gonna have perfect information, and so you need just enough to be able to tell your customers, at least this is what we're investigating, and this is how we're dealing with it, and this is how we recommend you deal with it, and we'll share more when we can. And getting to that point is very challenging, and managing that uncertainty, particularly with customers, is something that I think many companies struggle with. And the other point, and I think this gets to Chandra's point about scalability, that is really, really important, and something I've seen more in the last couple of years be a challenge, is just once you go to your customers, and this is one of the threshold questions you want to ask about, well, then you're going to get a lot of incoming. And so how are you going to manage that? And managing the incoming is the thing that I think most makes or breaks the response to a cyber incident, because if you do it well, people say, okay, you're on top of it, I trust you. If you don't do it well, they say, oh, well, they're fumbling, they can't answer my questions, so they probably don't know what they're doing. And so I think that that's one of the hardest things that companies run into in these situations.
That's such a great point. It's like come in as outside counsel too. Lawyers are sometimes the problem because they'll over-lawyer the responses to
Not John, he
the
doesn't
question.
over-lawyer.
Never. But that thinking through the frequently asked questions before you roll out the communication and making that your ability to answer those questions part of your strategy as to when you go out is something that often gets
Yeah, I go back to what Chandra said about the flexibility, the agility of your plan. I mean, I've seen many companies have like beautiful incident response plans, like 90 pages, got flow charts and graphics, but when the actual incident happens, do they use it? No, it sits on a shelf because it's too rigid, it's not flexible. The way I think about when you build a plan, keep two things in mind. One is it's about getting the right people involved at the right time, bringing in a cross-functional group from PR, communications, legal, and so on. They're experts at what they do, right? So you need to expose them to what's going on, and they're naturally going to have questions and know what to do. And then to keep structure around it, just to your point around the FAQs, is instead of having a flow chart like if this, then do that, just have a list of questions and considerations. Think about these things at the beginning of an incident. Think about these things at the end of an incident. A great example is, you might be in a post-mortem from an incident, and you're like, you know what, we really should have got law enforcement involved much earlier. So an easy corrective action is add a question at the beginning saying, should we involve law enforcement at this point? I mean, just that simple to remind yourself, and then you've got the right people asking those questions along the way.
John, what do you think about that, and particularly the law enforcement question?
Well, first, I agree. The best plans I've seen, and when I've seen companies execute and perform really well, is where they have somewhat of a playbook, but with the considerations and decisions that need to be made. And law enforcement, I think it's changed over the years, right? And again, many years ago, there was reticence or hesitancy to share with the government, to get law enforcement involved. Now I see many companies have moved along that curve and understand that public-private partnership can be invaluable navigating through a crisis. But where I see companies have challenges is if they've never worked with law enforcement before and they're trying to do it for the first time. And so having outside counsel and the right resources that have relationships and know how to navigate that to guide the company. And then there are companies that have really strong relationships with law enforcement, and they're able to, perform their own calculus on, what's the equation in terms of engaging with law enforcement and when does it make sense, and how do you do that in a way that it's mutually beneficial. And that's what the company looks for, right? The company is looking for a mutually beneficial relationship through that. So I've seen some times where it's been extremely successful, that partnership and that sharing. And I've seen other times where companies have struggled or they've been hesitant to share information, and I think it's impacted them in a way that maybe if they had thought about it differently, they could have produced a different outcome.
Yeah. And John and I have facilitated war games together, helped companies run it up to the board level. And if you remember, one of my favorite questions to ask during those war games is like, okay, at this point, would you involve law enforcement? And everyone goes, yeah, we should. And, okay, well, who are you going to call? We're going to call the FBI. Okay.
Yeah, who's calling?
Who's going to call?
Who's going to make the call?
Well, I know a guy, and okay, what's his phone number? I'm done now, right? So to Chandler's point, I think investing in building those relationships up front, and so much, it's not just about having a phone number and a name, it's also having trust, right? So those relationships, you don't want to have to build that relationship at 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday night, right? You want to build those in advance, and they take time.
And you do want the phone number and the name, and you want it on some other place than the system that just got taken down by ransomware. So like having it written down somewhere is a really good idea.
That sounds really obvious, but if you take one thing home, I cannot tell you how many times I've gone to help and all of the materials for the client are on the now locked up computer that they don't have access
And that's
to.
the velocity issue, which is you have to be able to operate at speed to accomplish things in spite of what's occurring situationally, right? If there's lack of communication. And, I've changed through a couple of industries, and each time I've gone in, I've had to go through and through my onboarding is who is the lead for the FBI relationship. And it's been different in each of the companies that I've been at, right? And so we have key stakeholders as we work through an incident response. I know, Brad, as you've changed roles, we often talk about, okay, we have a couple key stakeholders, communications, legal, who will make the law enforcement call they're critical to the core team, that crisis core team that's going to help navigate that incident and help guide the business and support the executive leadership team on making the decisions that they need to make during an incident. And often we talked about velocity, but we haven't talked about how time can be an enemy. When we're responding to an incident.
Play that out a little bit. What do you mean by time?
Well, sometimes, and I think, Siobhan, to your point, if you don't have the communications, some of your thoughts around your transparency and your strategy and how you want to position with your customers, people are trying to spend that discussion time when you are in crisis. And that's absolutely, to your point earlier, not the time to be doing that. So making sure you have those North Stars that then allow you to operate against, I think, is critically important. And I think we touched on crisis captain. People call them different things. They call them crisis commanders, crisis captains, but it's the incident leader. It's the one person that's responsible for driving the process within the company to make sure everything gets done. And often I've found when I've served in that capacity, I've had to go, you have 2 hours to make that decision. Get in a room with the right people, and in 2 hours I want a recommendation. And that's a very different mode of operation when your functions are normally, let's have another meeting. I want to consult with somebody else. I want to do this. And it's like, no, 2 hours, we're making a decision and we're going to go with it. And we're going to make that decision with ambiguity in some cases, trying to stay away from speculation and try to care for all the things that we need to care for in that moment. And I think that's a critical. There are critical timing elements to every incident that if you don't hit it the right way, it will impact your trajectory on whether or not your customers lose trust or confidence in you, or they go the other way and you're able to maintain and keep and even increase that confidence and trust in what you're doing.
To that point, what you're saying, I think in part is a delayed decision is you've made a decision and it's going to have an impact. So you haven't avoided the decision. You just may have made the wrong one by the amount of time it took you to reach the decision. And that's something you can practice with a clock. When Brad was talking about training, I don't see people do as much, but to literally do the Chandra exercise, or sometimes maybe Siobhan, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that people don't appreciate the downstream impacts. And this is where, again, communications can be your friend or it can really trip you up. We were working an incident not that long ago where a critical part of a legal filing got changed literally overnight. Like I woke up and I was like, whoa, what happened? And no one thought to tell the communication side of things. And so we had a whole set of materials that had to be rewritten like in a matter of minutes. And the client was very impatient. And it was, everybody was sort of in this scramble because a decision was made way later in the process than it needed to. And so it can have a lot of downstream impacts, again, because the slower, if you will, the communications materials are to catch up, then the harder it is to just demonstrate that you are on top of it, because the minute you have a public filing, you're gonna get a lot of incoming. And if you haven't been able to update the materials that you're using to answer customer incoming, then your people are not well equipped and they don't have answers. And even the minimal answers that are at least, they're not terribly satisfactory, but they are what you have. If you don't have that, then they just don't have anything. And it can be really, really hard.
It's one thing if you get the chance, because I think that's also a mistake I see in training. So if you're on the security side, it's not your job, and you may not know what are the core values of the company that are informing the CEO and making the decision, and that's something you can have a discussion about ahead of time. And there's not a right answer. I've had in different sectors, different times, and different points in your careers, you've been at different companies where that core value has been different. In one case, it might be the most important thing is trust. In another company, it might be security. Those sound similar, but they're actually quite different. And if trust is your first priority, you may communicate in a way that increases your risk for a period of time because it's public, but it's that important to you because of the customer relationship. Another company may choose to take the hit of not having been as forthcoming early on because what's most important to them is securing the system. So that you can do ahead of time. And then secondly, you can get your business side to prepare. Everyone says that we want to treat everyone equally, oftenly, whether it's B2B, business customers, or consumers. But the fact is often there are some who are more important than others. And you realize that in the middle of the crisis, but it's something you can figure out ahead of time. And then whose job is it in the company to talk to those? Who are those critical customers? Who's going to talk to them? And are they able to talk to them if the incident is one that renders the system unavailable? And what's the plan?
To your point around the values, the first part of that was, I think this is an opinion, but what I've seen in the way different companies have responded publicly is, and having worked directly, all of us with, sometimes together with certain CEOs, the ones who always have come out and fared better, and they didn't feel like it at the time always, but the ones who put the customers first, like said, I don't care about the stock price. I don't care about getting sued. We're going to do the right thing for our customers, and we're going to tell them what happened. Now, from a legal standpoint, sometimes that can be scary. From a comm standpoint, it can be scary. But I really do. I look at a few incidents that I've been involved in, and I was, at the time, like, you're crazy. You can't say that. But in the end, it proved to be beneficial because the customers recognized that, and they came back, and they rewarded the company for it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one case that I can talk about, because we actually ended up writing about it later, in the case, we worked with Under Armour when their MyFitnessPal app was hit, and it was 150 million users, and they had recently sort of taken a look at their corporate values, and the two that had risen to the top were transparency and commitment to athletes. And so the deputy GC who was kind of running, she was the crisis captain, she was great at it. She said, look, we've just done these things, and GDPR was sort of in the offing at that point. She said, we've lost, usernames, and it was hashed passwords, but there was still, some uncertainty there. And so she said, look, we got to get this out quickly because people have to be able to protect themselves. So we're going to go out in the next, I want 3 days, but 4 days is okay. And so we went out to 150 million users within 4 days because they were really clear transparency. And so it was like the full story all at once, ripped the Band-Aid off. And they wanted speed because they wanted people to have that information because they may have used those passwords, obviously not just for a running app, but also maybe for their bank account, even though you're not supposed to do that.
And I think as we think, oftentimes we focus on preparedness and actual incident response, and sometimes we don't talk enough about understanding the tail that comes off of the back end of an incident. And sometimes as security professionals, we say, okay, we've done the forensics, we've done the data analysis, we know what the impact is, we've done technical mitigations and response, we've restored services. Well, that's the technical piece. The comms tail, and you're dealing with comms through that, but the tail on any incident is longer, wider, and deeper than what happens when you are in the moment fighting the fire, either trying to regain control of your systems and get the hacker or adversary out, or whether or not there's been a significant data loss. That tail is deep and wide and long. And so as you think about not only preparedness and incident response, like one of the roles that we have to play is we've got to be looking 5, 10, 15 steps ahead. And you've got to be seeing beyond that, which is why these North Star values become critically important, because you're not going to change them midstream. You've got to operate in accordance with them. And so, you know, one of the roles that Brad and I play, and even you, is when I often say, they're like, what do you do? I was at a leadership meeting a couple weeks ago, and I had to introduce myself, and I say, well, we may meet in meetings, but there might be times where we meet and it'll be the first time you're meeting me and it won't be a good meeting. And at that time, I become your guide and your Sherpa to get you through the incident and to help translate and explain. You've done this many times, I know all three of you have, to guide the business team through what's going to happen and help them understand. And I know based on the recent ransomware experiences going on, just having more knowledge about having some kind of guidance on what you can expect, how, third parties, what are they going to do, what you can expect from your third party. That becomes really important in terms of incident response, because there'll be the core team that's built the plan, that's prepared, comms, legal, the cyber team, we're all ready to go. The business team is doing their preparation, the ELT, your CEO team, if they've done preparedness. But when you take more people than that through a process, you're often having to guide them, and you're not going to hand them the playbook and read it. You're going to, through the process of your meetings, declare, here's what's going to happen in the next 24, 72 hours, we think, unless, of course, the wild card, the news. Something goes into the news, right? That's always the wild cards, I think.
Or the hacker posts something.
Yeah, exactly.
They get a vote. Well, let's follow up a little bit on what makes ransomware a little bit different than other incidents.
I'd say the first thing when you think about ransomware and building out a playbook for that is have the conversation with your company first around just philosophically, like, would we pay, yes or no? Right? Again, not a decision you want to be having on a Friday night at 2 a.m.
Can I add an addendum to that, which is I've had a lot of really well-meaning clients, and even in government there's been the conversation as well, who think the answer is absolutely no, but the answer is really yes, because there's some set of circumstances that are severe enough that they will, and so with that in mind, it's probably better to have factors.
Yeah, exactly. And to the second point is, if you decide, yes, you will pay, or if you say no, either way, you should figure out how you're going to pay, right? We all don't have Bitcoin wallets ready to go. And again, my Friday night 2 a.m. example, you don't want to be trying to figure out how you're going to pay ransomware. You want to have those relationships, whether it's law enforcement, incident response firms, there's
Negotiators.
external
Have
counsels.
the negotiators on
Negotiators.
board.
Right.
Yep. You want to build those relationships out, test those processes before you get into the incident.
And that's the negotiator part. For those who haven't lived it, I mean, there are some very small niche companies now, because unfortunately, it's such big business for the bad guys, be they criminal groups, but also some nation states, that all they do is negotiate. And there's really kind of 3 or 4, I think, main players. A lot of the bigger companies won't do it, understandably, because of the risk. So you need to get paired with who that smaller company is who would do the negotiation that you're comfortable with. And one thing that people don't think of in advance sometimes is, even when you've made the decision, we are not paying ransom, you still may want to negotiate, because it can buy you, I don't know if you want to talk about this a little bit, Siobhan, it can buy you time where you have a little more certainty about when they're going to pop the data that they exfiltrated on some external site as part of their blackmail scheme. So it gives you a little more certainty on the negotiation. And secondly, they often give proof of life. And so they're giving documents that can help guide you to which servers were actually impacted and what you lost, and can help get you a jump start on what your communications and response plan are going to be.
Can I ask you a question? Do you see companies directly engage with the negotiating companies, or should they be using external counsel and then they engage the negotiators?
So I have seen both, and you're talking about in terms of engaging the third-party negotiator. Yeah. I think it's one that's just like your forensic firm, it's best to do through external counsel so that, and clarify that the purpose of it is in part to protect you from future litigation risk, which in a serious ransomware incident there always is. And the idea behind that in part is that that can give you the benefits of having the communications be privileged or work product, which means you don't need to turn them over in all instances if you're later in litigation. And that's more true in the United States. That privilege isn't as, there's not as strong a right to that privilege when you're in Europe. And so for multinational companies, often I think you need to remind some of your colleagues overseas that some of the regulatory risk is here and it's worth going through the privilege steps for the US.
Yeah, I think, and just to add what you were saying, John, about negotiators, I mean, I think that particularly if you're looking at kind of the broader and even kind of the technical management side of it, I mean, Chandra pointed out, like, time is not your friend. And so any way that you can kind of extend the time that you have to make some decisions is really important, or just to get your act together, right? Like if you're gonna have to go out potentially to a whole series of customers, you want to get to them before the threat actor does, right? Before the threat actor posts, before the threat actor starts calling them and harassing them. Same thing with your employees. Whoever's actually affected by this incident, you want to get to them first. And it does take time just to, get the mechanics of that together, particularly if your systems are down. And so when you're negotiating, you're negotiating for time, you're negotiating for information, and you're negotiating for a little bit more kind of, at least not really control over the process, but at least you can influence the process in a way that you can't if you're just sitting and waiting for somebody to drop something or not drop something, or waiting to see if you can restore from backup before something else happens.
And we touched on in our discussion with you today a few things, and I want to just highlight a theme, which is resourcing. Okay, and one of the things I see when companies go and look to respond from to a cyber incident, we talked about scalability, but about resources. And what I would share is every one of your companies, if they go through an incident, you have resources available to you. It is not just your technology teams and your security professionals, your comms, your legal. You have each company based on the industry they're in and the type of work they do, they have a lot of resource available. You have relationships. You have vendor partnerships that you can call on to help you, whether or not to help communicate and amplify your message, or to actually help you do work. And one of the things that I've had to do in a number of incidents is call on experts within the company to do work. So ones you wouldn't think of. At one company, I called the logistics me for the business, and I said, you are to report in within the next hour to the cyber incident command, and logistically, you are gonna help me move equipment and people to where I need them to get to respond, okay? Many times when teams start to run and do incident response and you have a new thing you need to do, you have people trying to do Excel spreadsheets that are not Excel spreadsheet gurus. You are losing time, you're not getting accuracy and results, okay? Who in your company can spin data on a dime, large volumes of it? You pick up the phone and you go, I need that resource in. And so one of the things that I think about in terms of resourcing, whether it's the negotiators for the ransom, outside counsel, forensics firms, crisis management communications firms, you need to think about every aspect of work that needs to be done within the work streams we've discussed and make sure you are bringing the best resource your company has, not who's assigned on the project right now, but you are bringing that best resource to bear on what you're dealing with so you have the necessary skill to get through what you need to get through. And when those people have been pulled into projects, it's like you're to report in, and I hope you're okay on 2 hours of sleep for, well, maybe six to 8 weeks, depending on what we're dealing with. And so this resource theme, I think, is really critical to the success of getting through an incident and being set up to handle that tail as well.
One thing you've all touched on, and it's one of the resources and with pros and cons of dealing with lawyers, both in-house and the external counsel. What are lessons you've learned, and what's your advice for CISOs out there or budding CISOs on how to deal with counsel?
You want to go first?
No, why don't you start?
Just involve them. I mean, so that concept of, having the, right people involved at the right time. I treat our legal team as an extension of our team, as part of our team. So I don't know the questions to ask. So whether I think they need to be there or not, I invite them there anyway. And over-involvement.
From a legal perspective, I've changed roles through companies a couple of times, and one of the things that's always been a critical activity for me was to sit down with the attorney that would be working directly with me. They usually are with me. My attorney's right here right now, invisibly, because we work so closely together, but she's with me. And one of the things is we went through a very practical activity. Preparedness was we sat down and we've gone through multiple scenarios, multiple use cases, and she and I have aligned on our philosophy for incident response. And where we've had disparity or a difference of opinion, we've talked through that, like, why would you go left versus right, and why is that? And it's bringing their experiences to bear, plus yours, in a manner. And so that philosophical alignment is, I think, critically important, because you don't want to be going into that and not know how your closest partner is going to move or direct activity. I'm very comfortable with outside counsel. I think they are invaluable. And I think one of the things we have to recognize is at times that there are multiple outside counsel firms involved, not just at the incident level, but maybe at the executive leadership level, maybe at the board level. And so, and in some cases, you have to work in partnership, because there are specialties with some of the outside counsel, right? There might be a lead, but there's a specialty from somebody else. And so, it becomes critically important to make sure the roles are defined, and the responsibilities, and who's driving the decisions, and the collaboration there that's required.
I will say something else. I'm not saying this because my legal team may be in the room here, but I'll tell you a story, and this is a past role I had where I went into the company after a major breach, and my job was to understand what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. So think about, what would you want to do? You'd want to know, how did the bad guys get in? What vulnerabilities did they exploit? What's the anatomy of the attack look like? Who did it, right? And if you paint that out, that looks like a really complicated picture, and it's something you have to document and write down. Well, lawyers don't like when we write things down because we're creating a trail. And I will tell you, for the first year, as I was trying to understand what happened and put controls in place to prevent it from happening again, we created a lot of documentation, and we struggled with what was privileged and what was not. And it was very frustrating, and we were like this for a year, until I started getting deposed, and I was under oath. And I was, coached, my attorney was sitting next to me, and I would be asked a question. So, Brad, can you tell us what happened at this point? And my lawyer would interrupt and say, I'm instructing my client not to answer that question because that is protected under attorney-client privilege. So I will tell you, coming out of that 8-hour painful deposition, I went back and hugged him and said, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you. I get it now. So I said, everyone should have to go through that experience, because when it is harder, it slows things down, it's extra bureaucracy, but there's a real reason for it. And that was a big lesson for me.
I think the other benefit we have when we use outside counsel is they're doing this for multiple companies, and they have the value that they bring in addition to their legal expertise is they know the current state, the last 10 matters that they've worked. They can apply all that knowledge in giving direction, counsel, and things like that. And so, you know, in our role, we don't see all of that. And so their expertise, I think, because they see so many different matters of different types, it's invaluable.
And I would just add one other thing when it comes to outside counsel. I mean, we have worked with companies sometimes that don't fully appreciate the importance of having outside counsel that does cyber incidents, that they kind of think, oh, you know, we can just get good legal advice. And that, you know, having people on your side who are doing this day in and day out and understand the legal ins and outs is really important, both for cyber counsel, but also making sure your cyber counsel also works really well with like their SEC counsel or whoever you have on for SEC, because we've seen sometimes the cyber lawyers and the SEC advice, it's not meshing. And that can have really significant consequences around like what's disclosed and how you're disclosing it. Like, are you disclosing ransomware? Well, no, you don't need to. But like there are some SEC counsels that say, no, you absolutely need to. And maybe in a circumstance that makes sense, but you'd want an SEC counsel that can actually tap into certain levels of cyber experience. Otherwise, you're gonna be in a position where you're perhaps disclosing things that create alarms or vulnerabilities or perhaps even legal risks that you don't need to.
That's a good, I think there's often a balance in discussing it as well, where ideally your counsel is spotting legal risks, but the legal risk, going back to the core values question, may not be the determining factor in how you communicate or what operational steps that you're taking. So while you're informed of the risk, ideally your counsel is also saying, but I've seen companies go a different way and accept the legal risk, and maybe the suit follows, but ultimately that was what was best for the business or the brand. All right, I have one for you. You've lived through some crazy experience. What's the craziest or most unusual thing you've had happen during your response to an incident?
I'll start. So in addition to agility, flexibility, scalability, and velocity, I will add wild cards. There are 3 for every incident. You don't know what form or flavor or how they're going to happen. One I'll share was we were running an incident, something made it into the news, and the next thing I got a call, and it's like, we think someone on your team who is actively running the incident leaked this information to the press, and we want to run an ethics investigation on your team while they're trying to work 24 hours, 25 hours in a day, 8 days a week to get through that. So that was a wild one. The other wild card is something called human behavior, and we all know about it.
I just pause you 1 second on the first one, because I think outside of having it as a wild card, it's a good experience, and I often get asked this question. You know, you have the NIST framework, other frameworks that all talk about doing your learning on what to improve at the end. So what I see happen so many times is there's, in the beginning, when you're still in the discovery, response, restoration phase of an incident, you start trying to investigate how it happened or what went wrong, and that's a great way to have people drop what they're doing and start thinking, more about their own liability than protecting the company.
Right, and a number of times, and the executive leadership wants to know that, and so the analogy I use is we are trying to put out the fire in the home. We are not trying to go in and put the new kitchen cabinets in, right? And we'll do the arson investigation, and we'll get you new cabinets, but right now we're trying to put the fire out. But the other wild card is human behavior, and in every major incident that I've been the lead for, when something happens in a company, there's just energy, and people need to do something to make it better, to help with the incident. And I've been on incident calls before, and someone will report in from the field, so-and-so went and did this. And we would talk with the lawyers, and they're like, well, that's not really good they did that. We don't want them to do that. But if they're doing that, we know exactly what they're doing. And if we tell them to stop, they're going to go do something else we might not be able to figure out. So just let them, spin their nervous energy off on doing that, because they feel like they're able to do something to contribute to response. So those are 2 of my wild cards that the second one, human behavior, happens consistently.
Siobhan?
A couple. First one doesn't have a whole lot to do with communications, although maybe a little bit. It was one where the CISO and CTO thought that they could actually just deal with the whole ransomware negotiation and everything and not tell anybody else in the company, which ended up backfiring. And at the very last minute, they had to tell everybody, and people were very unhappy about that. So I would not recommend that as a strategy. You should really, make it a team effort to deal with it. It's not like it's one person's fault that such a thing happened. So just share in the response. The other was just a bizarre one. We were working on an incident not that long ago, and we're kind of trying to crank through the ransomware incident, and they're really down. They have a lot of operational challenges, and they come to us and they say, well, how hard is it to get, there's this Bloomberg listing that the revenue of our company is this amount, and it's not that amount. Can we get that corrected? And I was like, I don't think that's really the time for this. Can we worry about that later? They said, no, because the threat actor came back, and they said they're asking for this level of ransom because this is our revenue, and it's wrong. We are not that big. And I said, well, we'll worry about that later. I'm not sure it's going to help your negotiation now, but I will say I think that was Black Basta, and they actually do look at public listings of what your company size is and things like that when they try to gauge how much you're going to pay. So just know that they do their research, such as it is.
I think the one that surprised me the most was a company got hit by ransomware, and they locked up all their systems, but they also stole all the data as well. And in the negotiations, they pushed back and said, we're not going to pay, right? We have the backups, we're going to restore. And then what surprised me was the level and the extent that the threat actor went through to get paid, to the point where they started taking their customers' data and calling and emailing copies of their customer data to their customers and encouraging their customers to call them and tell them to pay them, right? That was the most surprising thing to me.
I gotta say, thinking back, the biggest surprise, we wargamed for years in government what it would look like if a rogue nuclear-armed nation attacked the United States through cyber means, and we all got it wrong. You still could prepare and build muscle memory, but I don't know how many of you remember it. I had a surreal experience. First thing in the morning, we do our briefing with the Attorney General and the FBI Director. It's on threats, the time terrorism in particular. And instead, we started seeing the movie clip from The Interview with Seth Rogen to try to figure out what we were doing there, because it was about a movie about a bunch of pot-smoking journalists, which had highly irritated the autocratic head of North Korea, who had decided that in response to that offensive movie, he was going to attack Sony with a cyber attack. It's the only time in my career I've had to brief the President of the United States in the Situation Room and start the briefing with a plot synopsis of a movie. And for those of you who have seen the movie, and I blame North Korea for having to see the movie, it was not my personal favorite. It's a hard movie to summarize because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense as a film. I will say, look, one practice point from that though was although it was not the scenario that we expected, the same type of crisis decisions among the members of the National Security Council, or in your cases, the members of the executive leadership team, came into play, even though it wasn't an attack on the grid that we were expecting. The other thing that famously came out of that incident, is going to be my next question to you guys, is the President of the United States went out, and one of the things that he said was, this is a national security incident, but it's not an act of war. And that, in part, Sony had been talking to us, and their insurance would have had an act of war exclusion. That's not the only reason that the government said it, but it would have had a real impact if we had declared it an act of war. Lately, there's been much discussion with insurers over whether nation-state attacks in general are going to be excluded from policies. What's your thinking on the latest on insurance, and how should folks think about it?
So insurance is absolutely a risk mitigation lever that companies want to leverage. And as I think about the last 3 years, the standards have gone up and the expectations, so there's a lot more information that we have to provide, and the insurance companies are looking to carve out certain things that they would not want to provide coverage for. And so they're laser focused on, how do they, when they provide their offerings, the premiums and what they're covering. There's a lot of focus on that. And so we do a lot of work to make sure we're very clear on what our needs are and respond to all the questions that they have. But it has changed dramatically. And there are some companies that aren't able to get insured because they just can't meet some of the requirements. I don't know, Brad or Siobhan, if you have a...
Yeah, I think it's changed pretty drastically. I mean, I remember 3 or 4 years ago, we were working at Incident, and it was one of the earlier ransomware, maybe it wasn't ransomware, it was just extortion types of incidents. And basically, the company decided that they just needed to negotiate to get it just under what insurance would cover, which was a lot of money. It was like, probably close to $20 million. And I was like, wow, insurance is really part of the problem here. Like, this is not okay that like you can just, you're only gonna negotiate that far and then you're gonna suddenly pay, and that just encourages bad behavior. Now it's like swung the whole other direction. And I mean, I'm not in insurance, but one could assume that insurance companies had to pay out a lot of money when they had sort of that kind of approach, when companies were taking that kind of approach to their coverage. And so they have really cracked down, and they've cracked down on, how much they're gonna reimburse companies for their vendor or consulting relationships. And companies discover this after the fact. And so they've got a bill, and all of a sudden they have to pay like a much larger portion of that bill than what they ever expected, just because they didn't fully appreciate how difficult it was going to be to get insurance reimbursement. And so I think that having those types of conversations with your insurers at the outset and making sure you really understand what is and isn't covered is really important. And I mean, it may be that you decide, well, that's okay, like they're only going to cover this portion, and so we're kind of self-insuring or something like that. But you want to have that sort of business decision in your head before it happens.
Great. We've reached the end of time. Please join me in thanking these panelists that have lived it, hopefully, so you won't have to.